Alright, welcome to video 2 for your reproductive system. Now we're going to move on to the female reproductive system. So your ovaries are going to be your female gonads, or your primary reproductive organs, and each female has two, just like males have two testes. And within the ovaries are what we call follicles, and these follicles are little sac-like structures that contain your immature egg cell, or the oocyte. And the follicle will actually mature and enlarge when the egg is ready to be ejected from the ovary. And the ejection from the egg from the ovary is called ovulation, and it occurs approximately every 28 days. The ovaries are suspended by ligaments to the pelvis and the uterus by ovarian ligaments. So here is the inside of an ovary, and what happens is you're going to have a little primary follicle surrounding the egg, and as the egg is maturing, so is the follicle. The follicle is kind of helping to nurture the egg, and once the egg is ready for ovulation, the follicle will kind of rupture and allow this secondary oocyte now to get released from the ovary, and then the follicle will actually just degrade away. So now let's talk about the duct system. And remember in the males we talked about how they have the rete testi, the epididymis, the vas deferens. They have just this really enormous duct system. Ours isn't as complex in just that it's not as long, and this is going to be formed by the uterine tubes, the uterus, and then the vagina. So the uterine tubes are also known as the fallopian tubes. They're about 4 inches long, and once the oocyte, or the egg, is ejected from the ovary, it provides the site for fertilization. So a lot of people don't realize this. I think they think that fertilization happens in the uterus, but fertilization, where sperm meets egg, actually occurs in these fallopian tubes. The distal ends, so the ones that are actually kind of closer to the ovary, contain what we call fimbriae, which are these little projections that help create a current that actually can carry the oocyte through the fallopian tube. It's going to take approximately 3 to 4 days for the oocyte to reach the uterus, and the oocyte is only viable for about 24 hours. But I must say, I was talking to OBGYN, and she was telling me that they believe now that the egg can actually be viable for up to 72 hours, which is kind of interesting. You know, the more we learn as technology gets further and further. And sperm has to swim through the vagina and the uterus to reach the egg, which is incredible. So here is your ovaries right here. Okay, they're suspended to the pelvis. And if you look here is the distal end, which is the femimbrae, remember? So what these do is they create a current, so once the egg is ejected out, it can then travel through these fallopian tubes into the uterus. Okay, and this is where fertilization occurs, is in those fallopian tubes. Super interesting. Okay, so the uterus is our next organ. So we go ovary, fallopian tubes, uterus. That's kind of the track we're on right now. So this is going to be located in the pelvis between the urinary bladder and the rectum, and it's a hollow organ that's going to retain and nourish the fertilized egg. So your major portion is going to be referred to as the body, the top is going to be referred to as the fundus, and then the bottom is going to be referred to as the cervix, which then is going to be attached to the vagina. And here is I think one of the most interesting things about the uterus and how complex it is. It has an inner layer called the endometrium. And this endometrium is what is shed off when a woman has her period or menstruation. If there is a fertilized egg in the uterus, the egg actually implements itself into this endometrium. It like burrows into it. The middle layer is called the myometrium, and this is your smooth muscle layer. So this is what's contracting when you're going through menstruation and can cause pain. And this is what is also going to help deliver offspring when we go into labor. And then the parametrium is the outermost layer, and it's basically just a serous membrane that's going to help not create any friction in that internal environment. So here is our uterus, okay, and it's got those 3 layers. So the endometrium here is going to be your innermost layer, and that's what sheds every 28 days. Or if there's a fertilized egg, the fertilized egg will actually embed itself into the endometrium. Your myometrium is going to be your smooth muscle layer that helps with contractions. And then the parametrium is going to be the outermost layer, and it's just a connective membrane. Okay, and then below the cervix, we have the vagina. It's 3 to 4 inch long tube that pretty much is there to just receive sperm or help to expel the baby during delivery. Next, we're going to get on to the actual menstrual cycle, and this is once again fascinating. I think the female reproductive system is just one of the coolest things ever. And this is a kind of monthly cycle that every woman goes through once she hits puberty. And it all has to do with hormones, specifically estrogen and progesterone, which are your 2 major hormones produced by the ovaries. But it is important to remember that ultimately the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus is controlling it by releasing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Remember, that's a whole chain of events. So the hypothalamus is going to trigger FSH and LH to be secreted from the pituitary gland, which then is going to travel to these ovaries and cause an increase in estrogen and progesterone. So we're going to go through the days. Now, it's typically a 28-day cycle. That's what we refer to it as. So days 1 through 5 are going to be the menstrual phase. So this is going to be the shedding of the endometrium. Bleeding is going to occur for 3 to 5 days. And then by day 5, we're already going to be starting to produce more estrogen. Days 6 through 14 are called the proliferative phase. So estrogen levels are now going to be going up, produced by the follicle, and we're going to have regeneration of the endometrium, so it's going to start to build nourishment again. Ovulation is going to occur at the end of this stage in response to high luteinizing hormone in the blood. So ovulation occurs in this proliferative stage. And then days 15 to 28 is the secretory phase. This is when your estrogen and progesterone levels are really high and you have lots and lots of blood flow into the endometrium because your body is getting prepared for fertilization if it occurs. So the endometrium is actually going to start secreting even nutrients into the uterus in case fertilization does happen. And if fertilization doesn't occur, then those cells are going to die and we're ready to go back to day 1 in our menstrual phase. Okay, so if we look here, this is actually how thick that endometrial layer is throughout your entire menstrual cycle. So days 1 through 5, you can see it's actually going down. We're shedding that whole endometrial phase, and there's not a lot of blood flow because there was no fertilization. Then once we start to release estrogen again, and the follicles are creating estrogen, we're going to have that increase in our endometrial layer, and we're going to see blood flow start to go to it again. And then by the time we get to the secretory phase, remember ovulation is going to occur about right here. So if ovulation occurs here, we're going to suspect in the next 24 to 72 hours that we're going to have fertilization. So you can see this endometrial layer is very thick, very high blood supply, lots of glands here that can release hormones in response to thinking that fertilization is going to occur. Okay, Going back to estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is what's going to be produced by the follicles in the ovary, so it's actually helping your egg mature. This is also going to cause the secondary sex characteristics in females, so the development of breasts. The uterus actually enlarges. You're going to have pubic hair and armpit hair. You're going to have increased fat deposits around the hip and the breasts. The pelvis actually widens to help with childbirth, and your menstrual cycle is going to start. And then progesterone is produced when the follicle ruptures, and this is known as the corpus luteum. That's when the follicle actually ruptures. And here is something completely fascinating. Placenta is an organ that only is found in the body when pregnant. So women, not only are we growing a baby, but we also create an entire organ when we are pregnant. And this placenta is able to release progesterone. And it helps to keep your myometrium from contracting. This is important because you don't want your uterine walls contracting when you're pregnant. That would not be a good sign. We only want that to happen when we're ready to give birth. All right, now we're going to move on to pregnancy and embryonic development. So pregnancy is the results or the events that are going to occur from the time of fertilization to birth. And gestation is the time of the last menstrual cycle period until birth. So gestation period is approximately like when you go in and you're pregnant and they say, well, when was your last period? This is how they come up with your due date, is they take that date and then add 280 days to it. So an embryo is the term used for the developing organism from the time of fertilization up until week 8. After week 8, it is referred to as a fetus. So accomplishing fertilization, that sperm has to reach that oocyte. And like I said, the book says 12 to 24 hours, but my OBGYN told me that they're now thinking it's even between 72 hours, which is kind of interesting. It's going to take 1 to 2 hours for the sperm to reach the oocyte in the uterine tubes. And really, when ejaculation occurs, millions are going to be destroyed by the acidic environment of the vagina, and millions are going to leak out, which only leaves a few hundred to a few thousand that are even going to make it to the egg. Once the sperm reaches the egg, it uses enzymes to actually digest holes in the membrane of the oocyte. So this is how the sperm is actually getting into the egg. Once the sperm makes contact in the egg, the sperm actually fuses with the oocyte. And once the DNA enters into the cytoplasm, they come together and fertilization occurs. So once the two genetic material actually mixes, then we are going to have fertilization. And right when fertilization occurs, that first single cell is referred to as a zygote. And this is a picture of the sperm trying to enter into the egg. Once again, just a fascinating thing to think about is the head of this sperm can actually release enzymes that break through the ovum's membrane. And once it does, we have those two genetic materials coming together to actually form the zygote. And then we have our early stages of development. So cleavage is when the cells are actually starting to rapidly divide. And if you remember, the egg has many copies of organelles so that this cleavage can happen really quickly. Once the organism reaches about 100 cells, it's called a blastocyst. And we really are just a ball at this point. And we have an inner cell mass, which is just a cluster of cells. And this is at the point where it's going to embed itself into your endometrium. Next, that inner cell mass is going to develop into 3 different germ layers. You have the ectoderm layer, which is going to give rise to the nervous system and the skin. The endoderm forms different glands, and then the mesoderm is everything else, including various organs and muscles. So we're going to go ahead and stop here for this video, and then we'll finish up with the reproductive system in video 3.